Okay, right now I hope to explain the way in which Lyric chooses to render a scene. Because Lyric is a real-time rendering device, it doesn't have the luxury of non-real-time rendering devices that can render every pixel and achieve a perfect result. Because it doesn't have the luxury of time, it needs to make some rendering choices very quickly in order to render your scene on output. So the rendering has been exposed in the rendering panel on the right hand side here to enable you to hopefully get the desired outcome for your scene the way in which you want it to render. So once I've explained the way in which Lyric makes the choices on how it should render things, hopefully that will give you a little bit more power to manipulate your scene to actually render the way in which you want it to. So let's first have a look at 2D objects. So I've got JLo and Elvis here. So right now if I just put Elvis on top or JLo on top, I can reorder using the scene graph. So they've both by default come in at -2. If I now rotate them, so I take Elvis and I take, whoopsie-doo, and I take JLo there, and I rotate them in 3D space, right now I have two 2D objects rotated. So if this was a real world environment and two objects were sitting in exactly the same space and both being rotated, you would expect them to intersect each other somewhat like this. So there you can see that that's what you would expect to happen. By default in the rendering, 2D objects are told to have depth test disabled. So if I go ahead and enable the depth testing for both of those objects, you can now see that they are in fact intersecting. So no longer is my scene graph ordering applying. If I want to move JLo in front of Elvis, I would physically move her forward in Z space, and vice versa with Elvis. So you can see there, if we rotate them, that they're actually intersecting. And if we go ahead and render the back face as well, I can spin it around so you can see. Okay, so that is the depth testing on 2D objects. So this is to enable you speed. For example, if I was to bring in a 3D object, say a cube, there we go, we'll just put that there, and then a 2D object. By default, because the depth testing is off, I can just go, the cube is in front, no, Elvis is in front, and so on. So as soon as we enable the depth testing for Elvis, he goes inside the cube. So all of this is fine. Where it becomes a little bit trickier for the system is when we start introducing transparency. So I'm going to take the cube and just pull the transparency down a wee nudge, and you'll see that it's just chopping a nice big hole through there of Elvis. So first of all, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to draw the back faces of the cube so we can see the inside of our cube there. And now I just want to explain why this is happening. So when we have transparency, Lyric is not going to try and work any harder than it has to. So if it thinks it's drawn a pixel, it's not going to redraw it. So right now, one way of fixing this is to turn on 2-pass rendering, which means it renders the scene twice. So it renders it once drawing the cube, and then it renders it again drawing Elvis. So that's one way of fixing it, but this is actually making the system work a little harder because it's rendering it twice effectively. So one way around this is it will use, when everything is at -2 on the Z, Lyric will use the scene graph to choose the order in which it renders something. So, and it does this from the bottom of the scene graph to the top of the scene graph. So for example, if I take Elvis and move him below the cube on the scene graph, like so, now it's actually rendering Elvis before it renders the cube, thus giving us the desired result without us having to actually turn on the 2-pass rendering depth blend. So that's one way of doing it. Now, that's fine in a perfect world when everything is at -2, but that's not always the case. So let's just, for argument's sake, move Elvis back to the top. The other way that Lyric will choose what order it should render things is by the Z buffer. So it actually renders from the back of the scene to the front of the scene. So if I actually take Elvis and move him further back in space, see that? The further back he is, he will be rendered before the cube. So regardless of the fact that the cube is below on the scene graph, if Elvis is further back in Z space, he'll actually be rendered first. Now that actually applies to the nodes. So if you have your nodes and you position them in the order that you want them to render, you can force Lyric to do it exactly the way you want. But how do you then position them where you want them to be? Because it makes the choice on which order to render them via the node position, you can actually group the object and move the object forward, thus getting it exactly where you want it to be. And that allows you the total freedom of, you know, saying which order you want something to render in, but then using the group to position that that node. So there's a couple of other things. I'll just turn that off for a moment. Because the Z buffer renders from the back to the front, and a cube by default is doing a depth test, it's rendering effectively the back of the cube before it renders the front of the cube, and that's fine. So that's why we're seeing the inside here. But what happens when we take the back of the cube and we spin it around to the front? So if this cube was, say, rotating, for example, so suddenly the back of the cube, which effectively for Lyric's purposes it's already drawn, now becomes the front of the cube. It's not going to actually go ahead and redraw it again. So you can see that here we see the inside of the cube, no problems, but once we turn it around, we've suddenly lost the inside of that cube. And that's because the depth testing is forcing it to render from the back to the front there. So if we disable the depth testing, we can now see all the insides of our cube there, and it's drawing them all. It's a little tricky to see, but it is actually doing it. So that's all well and good, but how does that affect everything else? So I might just bring in a new object here. So let's say we've got JLo there, and we'll enable the depth testing on her, but she's not going inside the cube. Can you see that she's not actually going in there, which we would expect that to happen. We would expect her to go inside the cube. So we are effectively not getting the result we want because the depth testing is off for the cube. So how do we get around that? Well, we have another option here which works with grouped items. So I've just grouped the cube and JLo there, and when I turn on composite transform, she has gone inside the cube. My cube's a little dark, I might just pull the surface transparency down. So by putting them together in a group and then in the rendering panel telling JLo to composite transform, I'm getting exactly what I want. The composite transform will allow two objects to move around together in space, to transform, I guess, as part of a group. So regardless of the fact that the depth testing has been turned off for the cube, because we don't actually want we want it to render all of it. We don't actually want to test the depth from the back of the cube to the front of the cube. That will actually just happen when you have one solid object. So because Lyric thinks it's already drawn the back of the cube, it's not going to do it again. When you have different objects, you won't have that result. So right now, that explains some of the methods in which you can get Lyric to render your scene exactly the way that you want it to.